Hey everyone, it's Tim here. I hope you're doing well, and here for another update, including the next chapter of our book, Pentecostal Outpourings. And this chapter has to do with Scotland. The chapter is called Revival, a Scottish Presbyterian Perspective, and it's written by Ian Campbell. Now, Presbyterianism is really the denomination that dominates Scotland. Scotland is the heartland of Presbyterianism ever since the time of the Reformation. And this was the denomination that was basically what was tried and succeeded to be established as the state church there in Scotland. But over the centuries subsequent, there were a lot of developments there among the Presbyterians, including a lot of divisions into different Presbyterian denominations that we'll hear about in a moment. But Campbell, in his chapter, he talks about how there are a variety of opinions within Presbyterianism about how to think about revival, but the fact is that revival has been baked into the DNA of the denomination. It's happened on occasion intermittently throughout the history of the Scottish Presbyterians, and he documents, starting from the early 17th century all the way into the mid-20th century, a number of revivals that took place, some of them in one part of the country or another, some of them the whole country of Scotland. And in 1843, there was what was called the Disruption of 1843. And I mentioned division. There had been a lot of doctrinal drift in the main denomination, the main Presbyterian church, the Church of Scotland. And so there were some revivals actually among more evangelical wing of that denomination in the years leading up to 1843. A real stirring of God's Spirit through, as we've talked about many times, the ordinary means of grace, of the preaching of the Word, and the ordinances, the Lord's Supper and baptism. And the effect was that it kind of accentuated, it kind of highlighted the divisions in doctrine between the more biblical and conservative wing and those that were more drifting in a direction of they call it moderatism, but basically unbelief. And so that is what precipitated the first major rift. And there was a Free Church of Scotland that was a more conservative side that split off. Over the years, there were actually a lot more splits, and there have been a lot of divisions over doctrine and practice within the Presbyterians in Scotland. But he then talks a little bit about, he zeroes in on one region of Scotland, which is called the Isle of Lewis. That's Isle, like I-S-L-E, the island of Lewis, which is where Campbell is from. But he also says there's a particularly rich history of revival there. And so he documents some of the revivals that happened there in the Isle of Lewis in particular. And he zeroes in on a guy named Alexander MacLeod, who oversaw a revival that the Lord sent in 1824. MacLeod's example is very interesting because he came to this church that he was called to and in 1824, and he looked around and said, this is not a very healthy church. The members here don't seem to know much doctrine. They don't seem to be personally believing, a lot of them. And so there was just a lot of kind of unbelief in the church and a lot of spiritual deadness there. And so it was really encouraging that he saw this as an issue and knew he needed to teach and preach faithfully. And for a time, he actually stopped doing the Lord's Supper. They just didn't do it in the church. And there was some controversy among different denominational leaders about this move. But his argument was, there's pretty much a bunch of non-believers here, and I don't want us to be doing this when we're not there. There needs to be just a clearer sense of people being affirmed in the gospel. So eventually, a couple years in, they did have a communion service. And it's interesting, the way that they did in the Scottish churches, the tradition with communion is, some churches, a lot of denominations will do communion every week. And then some others will maybe be more of a once a month kind of a thing. And we've settled on a twice a month pattern. The Scottish Presbyterians, historically, they did it, it was kind of extreme. They did it like once a year. And it would be called communion season. And it would be this big event. And people would come from all around to do these communion events, and there would be a lot of preaching and things like that. And over the years in Scottish revivals, often it was these communion seasons that kind of were the moments where God sparked a revival. It would often be when God did send revival, it often came during these communion seasons. And so that's what happened when finally MacLeod says, okay, I think we're ready for some people to start observing communion. They scheduled and they held one of these communion seasons. And it says only 6 individuals came forward to the Lord's table, which I think is a good sign if indeed there is this spiritual deadness pervading the church, but there's an increasing sense that people had of the fact that they're not Christian. And that's a good sign when you have a lot of people who think they're Christian starting to realize that they're not. Of course, you want to see people coming to Christ from there. And that seems to be what happened. It says, when the elements were presented, there appeared as a shower of revival from the presence of the Lord through the whole congregation. And so there was a lot of people watching and only 6 people participating. But that event, of course, in conjunction with the preaching of the word that attended it, the Lord used to really bring about salvation to many. And there was years of this revival there on the Isle of Lewis. And he goes through other times when revival came over their history there. And he talks a little bit about the role of feelings with revival. And this has come up a few times in our book. Revival can often be attended with strong feelings, a strong sense of conviction of sin, or a strong sense of the weightiness and majesty of God, or a strong sense of the goodness of God in the gospel of Christ, a freeness of the burden of sin, things like this. And I like how he says this. At the same time, it was true that the whole counsel of God was declared from the pulpits, and no attempt was made to cater for the stirred feelings of the listeners. So he said feelings were being stirred, and that's appropriate in a way. But the preachers were being careful not to be trying to stir up emotion and trying to froth up a sense of excitement, which can be so tempting to do. And he says this: those who were converted during it, the revival, were deeply stirred in their feeling, but did not live on their feelings. There is a great difference between the two. And we've talked over some of these chapters about the difference between revival, which is a surprising work of God's Spirit through ordinary means of grace, and revivalism, which is kind of a man-generated attempt to bring about the same thing, which is always going to be focused on effects. This is one clear watershed thing where he's saying, at least in these revivals he's talking about, there were effects, but those who were leaders, thank God, saw and they had the discernment to realize we don't want to just engineer everything to create these effects. Still, what people need are the ordinary means of grace. And God, again, just in his mysterious providence and his goodness, is pouring out power for special effects of his word. So after going through that story, he closes by giving what he calls 3 perspectives on revival. And it's interesting, just different ways of looking at the phenomenon of revival, especially as it's illustrated in Scotland. His 3 perspectives, the first one is historiographical. And this is what we've covered. I just talked about it, but the difference between revival and revivalism. Sometimes historians look back and they kind of mix the two, or they don't distinguish between the two. And Campbell, like so many of our other authors, have kind of beaten the drum of we have to distinguish between revival, which is a surprising work of God, and revivalism, which is man's attempt to create the same effects, which we can't do because salvation is only of the Lord. We have only to be faithful and pray for his blessing. The second perspective he gives is social, just acknowledging that sometimes social conditions were related to the occurrence of revival. Sometimes God sent revival and there had been maybe disasters, national disasters, or hard times socially. And I think he has a good balanced perspective on this. He doesn't deny that this can happen. We know that God uses natural and supernatural means in mysterious, mixed ways. And so he wouldn't want to deny that there can be special moments, like historically, when people might be more ripe for revival. But there can also, on the other hand, be kind of a cynical, secular lens on this that can purely see it as a social phenomenon and kind of going, oh, what were the historical kind of human factors, sociological factors that kind of led to this response? And he says, hey, look, mostly it's just a work of God. We believe in supernatural things that God does, but still not denying that things like disaster can sort of prepare the soil, and God mysteriously does use those things. The third perspective is denominational. And after having talked about kind of the splits that happened historically among Presbyterians in Scotland, he talks about, it's interesting that when you look at the history of revival, certain denominations have seen a lot more of it than others. Certain denominations, and it seems like it's tied with denominations that have been more biblically faithful, more faithful to those historic doctrines, and others that went more in a liberal theological direction have not seen as much. But there's also mystery there too, in which denominations God chose to bless. And he even presents some challenging heart questions about, if your neighbor's denomination sees revival and you don't, in answer to your prayers, how are you going to react? We may pray for revival and think that we have this large-hearted desire for Christ to be glorified, and that's all we want. But if we see other corners of, other corners of Christianity and those who believe the true gospel, we're not saying those who would be denying the gospel, but if we see other denominations or churches or groups that affirm the same gospel, even may have differences than us on other matters, seeing true revival and not us maybe, would we still be able to celebrate and praise God for his powerful work to save? So that was some good reflections there. But he also said that sometimes revival led to increased fellowship between denominations, where there had been divisions over various issues, but when the Spirit of God is working, the Spirit of God can bring about a refreshed unity among Christ's people. We're told in Ephesians 4 to be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And so when God's Spirit is working in extraordinarily powerful ways, we would hope to see unity among those who know Christ that would increase, and that has happened sometimes historically. So, helpful chapter by Campbell. I really appreciated this one. And I want to move into some announcements for us as a church. So we have this Sunday our equipping hour at 9 o'clock. This is our last lesson on the series on meeting with God, and it is also the last lesson in the school year before we go into our 2-month break in July and August. So we'll try to finish strong there. Jason's teaching. Look forward to that. Then we have corporate worship at 10:30, and then we have community groups at 5 p.m. Also, just a reminder, Greg's on his study sabbatical, working hard on his D-Min final project. So be in prayer for him and Lori. Also, as they are still dealing with issues with the care of Greg's dad from afar and Lori's stepdad, Jerry, who lives with them. Also, just want to let you know about something that's going on next month for us as a church. And the Cornerstone Bible College and Seminary, where I went and got my MDiv, and a place that we love as a church and pray for. We're going to be hosting a class that they hold this summer, July 18th to 22nd. This is a seminary class, so it'll be taken by seminary students for credit. It's an intensive, so it's just basically all day, every day that week. And we're going to be hosting it here at RCG, so just so you know what we're doing with our facilities, and it's a way that we can bless the work of the seminary, come alongside and partner in the work of the gospel there. So be praying for that and just aware of the use of the facilities there. It's also possible to audit the class. So for people who aren't enrolled seminary students, and including at the Bible college level, so this would be something that both men and women could enroll in in a way to audit it. So it's $100 to audit. You can find information on the Cornerstone website, or talk to me if you are interested in auditing, but we'll have some info about this class in church bulletin and newsletter, so be looking out for that if that's an interest to you. This probably wouldn't be something that a lot of you, I anticipate, would want to do, but certainly if you have an interest, the topic is going to be on the doctrine of God the Father, taught by Ryan Rippey, who is actually the president and one of the professors there. So it should be an edifying time. So anyway, if you're interested in learning more about what that might look like, feel free to talk to me. But that's it for announcements. So look forward to seeing you on Sunday. And until then, bye-bye.